This is a TGF audio post coming to you from Wiley, Texas, and I'm Jeff Sturtz. There's nothing like good quality service. Why is that? Why is service, whether it's at a dealership or a restaurant or a grocery store, so important to us? Well, there's the obvious fact that if we know we're going to be served well, we're going to get what we need with as little headache as possible. But we also recognize that there are different levels of service, even good service. There's the kind of good service that has been implemented well as a system. You can experience customer service at a business and know that guy or that girl has been well trained, and this business has solid systems in place to make sure that the customer gets what they need so they're happy. And why do they need to be happy? Well, so they'll come back, and so they tell their friends to come back. It's good customer service. But there's, of course, an agenda to it, and they're hoping for a return on the invested service. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good way to run a business. Then there's the service that you receive, whether it's through a business or an event or maybe a place that you frequent, where the service has crossed the threshold from being a good system to where the individual serving you almost forgets where they are at the moment and takes a real interest in you as a human being. They show you that they care about who you are. Maybe they're in a position of service, but they've gone above and beyond to treat you like a human being rather than simply a client or a customer. And then I would say that there's even a higher level or really a totally different world of service that exists. And it has nothing to do with businesses or job titles or anything like that. It is one human being who actually stops and sees another human being, and without any underlying motive or prospect of return, cares. They are moved with compassion, and they want nothing but to meet a need and to make that person know that they are cared about. This kind of service is a service all of its own, chiefly because it is rooted and fueled by love. If you haven't listened to part 1 of this discussion, you're welcome to do so, and if not, that's totally fine. But in our study of Galatians, we see Christians, they're indwelled by God's Spirit, and yet the way they have chosen to live their lives is worlds different than what God intended, and it fails to fulfill what the Christian life is meant to be and what it's meant to produce. We know from Galatians, and actually even more so from the book of Romans, that one of the purposes of the law, the Mosaic law, was to amplify and to accent transgression. In other words, if you didn't know that you were crossing the line before or that crossing the line was bad, you certainly know it now that the law of Moses codifies it. It takes what is already wrong and makes it clearly wrong. And it thereby shows you that you are a transgressor in need of God's mercy and forgiveness. And mankind needed mercy and forgiveness before the law, but the law came and it made that need even more clear. But that didn't mean that the law itself was sinful or that God filled it full of rules like, hey, stand on your head for 10 hours straight, just so he could say, you can't do it. Instead, the laws within the law of Moses all had a certain direction and aim to them. Jesus said that the 2 greatest commandments in the law of Moses were, number 1, to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And number 2, which Jesus said is similar to the first, is to love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus said not only that there are no greater commandments than these, but that all the other commandments hang on these 2. So if you can imagine the law of Moses being wrapped up in a large net and then being hung on a strong peg, these 2 commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor, are that peg. And what happens when you pull out that peg? Well, the whole fulfillment of the law comes crashing down. In other words, you can't really obey and fulfill the law unless you are also loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Conversely, every law in the Old Testament in some way points to these two commandments. So what does this have to do with the letter to the Galatians and freedom in Christ that we've been talking about? Well, the Galatians, the people in the church of Galatia, they had been convinced that the only way they could truly experience God's righteousness or justification was by adding works, the works of the law, on top of their faith in Christ, or in addition to. In other words, that their faith in Christ wasn't enough to gain God's righteousness. Instead, they had to work for it. And this wasn't their idea, and it wasn't God's idea. It was introduced by Jewish zealots who adopted Christianity, but with impure motives, tried to force the law into their Christian faith. They entered the church life. They introduced this pseudo-gospel, or a perverted gospel, which Paul says another gospel is an entirely different gospel. It's not a gospel at all. And it's one that required the works of the law on top of salvation. They told the Gentile Christians, and again, Gentile Christians primarily, that they needed to be circumcised, one of the requirements in the law. And so, kind of cheating ahead here into chapter 6, Paul writes about these false teachers and says in 6:12, "It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, and only," and here's their motive, "and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ." Why? Because they're falling in line with the strong, militant Jewish, tradition. "For even those who are circumcised," speaking of these same false teachers in the church, "do not themselves keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh." So the only reason why they're doing it is to avoid persecution and to sort of put a notch in their gun, that somehow they've rounded up one more recruit and are somehow effective in their ministry because they have produced this in the Gentile in the Galatian church. So here we have Gentile Christians trying to keep the law of Moses as a means to gain righteousness. But this effort is vain, and it fails on two different levels. The first we've already seen and we've looked at, and that is that Christians do not need to live under the law. We live in Christ, and we live by the power of Christ. So the law of Moses is no longer what governs us as God's people, but instead the Spirit of God that's in us. The second reason why this effort to keep the law fails is because of the whole issue of love. Remember, love is the greatest commandment as it relates to other human beings. It is the peg that is necessary for the fulfillment of the law. So if we were to pull open the cover and peek into the life of the Galatian church, are we going to see people at this moment, when Paul's writing, loving each other, showing love to one another? No. They're bending over backwards to keep the law, but are they actually fulfilling it? Are they fulfilling the greatest commandment of the law? No. What we see based on Paul's letter here is a church that has fallen into competition mode. They're stepping on one another, they're using biting and devouring language, judgmental attitudes, etc. Love has left the building. This is the result of a rules-based Christian life, and it is also the result of a recklessly free Christian life. And both of these positions ignore God. And if you remember in our previous post, we talked about people who swing the other way from this sort of law-based Christianity, and they say, "Oh, I don't have to live under the law? Great, I can do whatever I want, and God will accept me." And if we let that play out, we're going to see, just like the rules-based Christianity, that it will be a church life empty of love. It's a me-centered Christian life. So let's listen to Paul as he ties this together, and then we'll make some practical application. So Paul says in Galatians 5:13, where we left off last week, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. But," so here's the positive, "through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word," or one idea, one statement, and that is this: "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you're not consumed by one another. So we see that freedom in life is not a taking kind of life. It's not a consumption-based life as it relates to my Christian brothers and sisters. Freedom in Christ is not so I can get and take and consume. Freedom in Christ is the opposite. It is a giving-based life. It is a love-based life. It is a service-based life that is rooted and grounded in love. And in this love-based life, we are, by God's Spirit, actually fulfilling the greatest commandment of the law. It is by the Spirit of Christ in us that we are actually made capable of properly loving our neighbors as ourselves. So it's really kind of sad when you look at the church in Galatia at this moment, because the very law that they thought they were fulfilling by adopting circumcision and these other ceremonies and things that these outside Jews had brought in, that was the law that they were totally failing to keep. And they were totally failing to keep it because there was no love. They were not fulfilling the greatest commandment. They had set aside Jesus' righteousness that he paid for with his blood and instead tried to manufacture their own righteousness. They set aside living a life of dependence on God's Spirit and instead lived a life of dependence on themselves. So, on a more encouraging path, how do we then, by God's Spirit, love our neighbors as ourselves? Now, I want you to stop and think about that idea. Really think about it. Loving somebody the way you love yourself. And if we're all honest with each other, that's a lot of love. We care for, nurture, take care of, plan for, dream about, get excited about, and work to please ourselves most of the time. And that's not entirely bad, and we do have to care for ourselves. And Paul says to the Ephesian church, "For no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it." And he compares that to Christ then cherishing his body, the church. So, yes, we care for and value our own lives. So at that level of care, we are supposed to care for and love others around us. Wow, that is a tall order. How do we do it? We do it by daily trusting in and walking with God. We're going to see later that God actually produces fruit in us. This is called the fruit of the Spirit. That is, God works in our hearts and minds ways of thinking and acting that are loving and beneficial to those around us. So that fruit then is sourced in a walk with God, daily being in communion with Him and cultivating our hearts and minds with the truth of the Bible. When our minds are renewed like this, we are better equipped to love our neighbors. We can actually think, this is good for them, and this is bad for them, and this is how I can serve them genuinely. But I also said that it is daily trusting in God. What do I mean? We can look at others around us and see a need, or we can see how we, if we were them, would like to be loved. But the mess and the risk of loving that person scares us. It's going to take me some discomfort. Or what if they don't accept or appreciate me trying to meet their need? Or what if they do? What if they're really needy and now I have to deal with them? This is going to mess up my schedule. People are going to think I'm weird. This is going to cost me time or money or both. See, there's a faith element to this because it's something that God calls us to do. So if He wants us to do it, we should do it. And so we have to look at that command and say, okay, challenge accepted. I'm going to trust in You, Lord, to give me what I need to carry this out, to love my neighbor as myself. So in this life of love, empowered by God's Spirit working in us, we are no longer living a me-centered life. I'm not trying to step on someone or get ahead of someone or use someone or leave someone in the dust or avoid people, etc. I'm now actively looking to see how can I serve someone through God's love? Who are the people in my sphere that I can reach and affect with the love of God? So this is totally a different way of thinking. And I want to challenge you then by way of application, and this might be just night and day for the way you live your Christian life, or maybe it's kind of a refresher or whatever. But let me challenge you. Ask God, okay? I dare you. Ask God, who is someone that I can serve through love? Show me someone that I can affect with the love of Christ. And you might just change someone's life. And by God's grace, this life of love might just change yours. If you'd like to know more about who we are, visit texasgospelfellowship.org. If you're living in the Wiley area and you're looking for Christian community, come out to one of our local Bible study groups. You can find the times and locations on our website. Also, if you have a question about what it means to be a Christian, or how to know God personally, or how to better grow as a Christian, please feel free to reach out. You can email me via the contact form on our website. Lastly, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section of the video, whether on YouTube or Facebook. And if you have a subject that you'd like to discuss, either leave a comment or send a message. We might not be able to hit every topic, but I'd certainly like to explore the scriptures with you and find answers together. I look forward to meeting with you again. God bless.